The lake behind the narrator's home had once been the centerpiece of the entire community. Clear water, cattails swaying lazily in the breeze, ducks paddling across the reflective surface. When the narrator first bought the property, the real estate agent made a point to mention it was the selling feature, a private lake preserved and maintained by the homeowners who lived around it. The narrator envisioned peaceful mornings sipping coffee while watching cranes glide across the sky, truly believing this was a suburban paradise. But that was before the HOA existed. The Homeowners Association had started small, just a few overly eager neighbors convinced that rules and regulations would protect property values. The narrator had voted against forming it, but the majority pushed it through. At first it was tolerable. They sent out newsletters about landscaping standards and scheduled community barbecues. The narrator shrugged off the occasional warning about lawn height or mailbox paint color, determined to live quietly, without conflict. However, as the years passed, the HOA changed. New leadership took over. Words like compliance, mandatory fines, and board enforcement showed up with alarming frequency. The lake, once a shared treasure, became a political tool. The association claimed responsibility for its maintenance, but refused to accept responsibility when things began to go wrong. The narrator noticed the first sign of trouble on an early autumn morning. The water no longer sparkled. Instead, it had dulled into a lifeless shade of murky green. A strange chemical odor wafted through the air, sharp and unnatural, making the narrator cough and step back from the dock. At first, it seemed like an isolated issue, perhaps runoff from a storm or nearby construction. But the ducks, normally bold and noisy, were nowhere in sight. Not a ripple disturbed the murky surface of the water. The narrator brought concerns to the next HOA meeting. The board members brushed it off, claiming they had treated the lake for algae growth, insisting it was perfectly safe. They assured everyone that the treatment would restore the lake's aesthetic appeal. The narrator left the meeting uneasy, clutching the printed minutes that so neatly disguised what felt like negligence. Within a week, dead fish appeared along the shore. Their limp bodies floated aimlessly, eyes clouded and scales dull. The narrator felt a twist of anger in the gut. This wasn't a minor issue. Not anymore. Concern turned into urgency. The HOA still insisted nothing was wrong. They blamed natural algae blooms and seasonal changes. Yet every morning, more fish washed ashore. Neighbors complained about the smell, hanging their noses over pinched fingers as they walked their dogs. The board's silence became harder to ignore. One evening, under the glow of a fading sunset, the narrator noticed something else. Barrels. Large, industrial-looking containers lined up near the lake's maintenance shed. Their surfaces streaked with chemical stains. A bold symbol on their sides warned of hazardous material. The narrator's pulse quickened. Those barrels did not belong anywhere near a protected environment. It didn't take much digging to uncover the truth. Under the leadership of their newly elected, power-hungry president, the HOA had hired a low-cost contractor to enhance the lake, meaning they dumped industrial-grade herbicides and runoff chemicals directly into the water, far beyond permitted levels. These weren't harmless algae treatments. They were toxic waste. The narrator gathered evidence, taking photos and jotting down observations. But the more damning discovery came later, when overhearing two board members arguing outside the clubhouse, their voices low but urgent. They were worried the chemicals could violate environmental protections. They spoke of hiding invoices, modifying paperwork, and keeping residents uninformed. The narrator realized the board wasn't merely incompetent, they were covering up a crime. Over the next days, the lake deteriorated rapidly. The water turned nearly black, and a thick, foamy scum collected near the shore. The reeds shriveled. The breeze carried metallic fumes that lingered in the back of the throat. Pets who ventured near the water became sick. Children played farther away, their parents throwing cautious glances toward the board members who still dismissed concerns with rehearsed confidence. The narrator had seen enough. Driven by equal parts moral obligation and personal fury, the narrator contacted environmental regulators, the EPA. Everything was documented. The photos of barrels, the dates of chemical dumping, dead wildlife, strange discoloration. The narrator hit submit on the online complaint form and felt a surge of resolve. If the HOA wanted to silence the issue, they were about to face a reckoning. Days passed. The narrator waited, tension coiling tight with every HOA newsletter that continued denying the obvious truth. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, federal vehicles rolled into the neighborhood. Agents in official jackets stepped out with clipboards and testing equipment, heading straight toward the maintenance shed and shoreline. The board president rushed toward them, red-faced and sputtering through excuses. Neighbors watched from windows and doorsteps as the agents lifted dead fish, scraped foam samples, and photographed the toxic barrels. The narrator stood at the edge of the property, heart pounding with vindication. The EPA representatives spoke curtly to the president, whose expression shifted from arrogance to pale, trembling panic. Board members who once ignored complaints now exchanged terrified whispers. Word spread quickly, faster than wildfire gossip ever had in the community. Faces appeared behind curtains. Whispered questions filled the streets. The thick veneer of HOA superiority had finally cracked. That night, the board sent out a frantic email claiming everything was under control, insisting residents remain calm and patient. They said a miscommunication with a contractor caused the issue. They claimed the EPA's presence was a routine inspection, but the fear in their words was unmistakable. Panic typed between every line. The narrator knew this was only the beginning. Cleanup, restitution, accountability. Those battles still lay ahead. The lake remained poisoned, the wildlife devastated, trust shattered. One victory did not erase the damage, nor did it guarantee justice. The narrator's peaceful sanctuary had become a battleground, and the HOA, once merely a nuisance, was now an enemy worth confronting. As the moonlight shimmered faintly across the damaged water, the narrator made a silent vow. The board would not escape consequences, not after what they had done, not after the lies, the denial, the destruction. The lake deserved better. The narrator would make sure of it. The next chapter of this suburban war had already begun. The morning after the EPA's arrival, the HOA's panic spread like a silent disease across the neighborhood. The board president, once a self-assured figure strutting across cul-de-sacs with a clipboard, suddenly appeared smaller, defeated, hurrying from house to house with a stack of vaguely reassuring flyers. The HOA framed itself as the victim, misled by a negligent contractor, blindsided by bureaucratic oversight, working tirelessly for the community's best interests. But the stench of the poisoned lake still hung in the air, and no carefully crafted excuses could mask it anymore. Residents were waking up to the truth. A few had already called their own lawyers. Parents forbade children from playing near the water. Even the geese that occasionally visited seemed to recognize the sickness beneath the surface. They flew overhead in uneasy patterns, refusing to land. The lake, once a symbol of property value and serenity, had turned into an eyesore that people avoided looking at directly, as though acknowledging it would force them to confront the negligence they once allowed. The narrator watched it unfold quietly. There was a dark satisfaction in seeing the HOA scramble, but also a sinking weariness. For all the progress made by calling the EPA, the narrator understood that environmental investigations moved slowly. Bureaucracy rarely delivered swift justice. Meanwhile, the HOA still held authority, still had the power to retaliate, and that retaliation came swiftly. Within days, the narrator received a thick envelope in the mailbox, a formal violation notice. According to the HOA, the narrator's fence height exceeded regulation by 2 inches. The narrator's mailbox paint was fading inconsistently, and the grass, measured meticulously, was a quarter-inch too long. The pettiness was staggering. A barrage of fines followed, each one delivered with the smug pretense of community standards. This was their warning: keep quiet, or they would make life unbearable. But intimidation had the opposite effect. The narrator kept every notice, scanned and saved each document, building a meticulous folder of evidence. Because while the HOA played a game of petty rules, the narrator prepared for a legal war. The EPA agents returned 2 more times that week. They wore protective gear as they waded into the water, their boots sinking into sludge that was once a thriving habitat. They collected barrels and loaded them into specialized trucks. The narrator overheard enough to understand that multiple hazardous chemicals were present, substances banned from consumer use and strictly regulated in environmental settings. The HOA hadn't simply used an excessive amount of herbicide. They had illegally dumped industrial waste. Behind the scenes, the board fractured. Whispers leaked of finger-pointing and backstabbing. The treasurer blamed the president. The president blamed the contractor. The rest of the board blamed ignorance. They acted as though they were helpless, as though documents with their signatures didn't exist, as though they hadn't approved everything in order to save money and inflate their own reputations. Neighbors began approaching the narrator privately, not out of solidarity, but fear. The families with sick pets wanted answers. Homeowners who feared their property values would plummet nervously asked if the EPA would fine residents too. Those who once eagerly enforced HOA rules now avoided eye contact when passing the narrator on the sidewalk. The narrator became an unspoken symbol, either a hero or a traitor, depending on who was asked. But the worst was still unfolding within the lake itself. The water thickened into a gelatinous mass. Patches of dead grass spread outward from the shore, like infection creeping through the soil. Even in the cold morning air, a chemical heat radiated off the surface, shimmering faintly and sickeningly. The ecosystem was collapsing beyond recovery. Every time the narrator opened a window, a bitter, metallic odor seeped in. It clung to clothing and hair, made meals difficult to eat, and reminded everyone of the irreversible truth. The lake was dying, and the HOA had killed it. The EPA issued an official notice to the community, an advisory declaring the water hazardous to humans and animals. This terrified residents far more than dead fish ever could. Suddenly, the HOA's lies held no power. The written warning was stark, unforgiving, and undeniably real. Homeowners demanded an emergency meeting. The HOA reluctantly obliged, but the narrator did not attend. Instead, they watched from their living room window as cars packed the streets, neighbors filing into the clubhouse with grim expressions. What occurred behind closed doors was unknown, but the aftermath spoke volumes. As people left, tempers flared in hushed but heated arguments. Some residents stormed to their cars, slamming doors and speeding away. Others lingered outside, shoulders hunched, defeated. The once united facade of suburban order had shattered. A day later, the board president resigned. A terse email declared it a personal decision, but word spread that he had been threatened with criminal charges. One by one, other board members stepped down as well, abandoning the ship they helped sink. Yet even leaderless, the HOA structure remained, like a headless beast still capable of thrashing. Fines didn't stop. Notices didn't stop. Harassment didn't stop. Someone on the remaining committee blamed the narrator openly, claiming all the chaos began because one homeowner made a fuss, instead of letting the board manage the situation quietly. As if silence could cleanse poison, the narrator received cold stares from residents who cared more about their property value than truth. Others, those who once smiled in passing, treated the narrator like a pariah, fearing association might worsen their own standing. That was the tragic reality of HOA communities. Conformity mattered more than morality. Still, there were those who quietly supported what the narrator had done. A basket of bottled water left on the porch with no note. A neighbor offering a sympathetic glance from across the street. Those gestures didn't erase the narrator's isolation, but they offered a reminder. Some people saw the truth and were grateful someone acted. The narrator knew that exposing the scandal wasn't enough. The EPA could issue fines, criminal charges could follow. But real justice, the kind that restored what was lost, seemed impossible. The lake wouldn't magically return to life. Memories of clear water and wildlife would remain just that. Memories. Yet the narrator couldn't stop. They owed it to the environment, to the animals, to the very land beneath their feet. And maybe, in a deeper place, they owed it to themselves. Proof that one homeowner could stand against corruption and win, even when the cost was steep. As autumn deepened and trees shed their leaves into the rancid water, the narrator stood at the shoreline, the wind brushing through dying cattails. The lake was silent, an unnatural silence that felt like mourning. This was far from over. The battle against the HOA had only shifted forms. Now came lawsuits, cleanup orders, accountability that would leave no room for excuses. The narrator straightened their shoulders, ready for whatever came next. Because no matter how sick the lake had become, the narrator refused to let the truth be buried beneath it. The real fight was about to begin. The departure of the HOA board president and his allies did not bring peace. Instead, the association slipped into chaos, desperate to retain control, yet fractured beyond leadership. What remained of the board operated like a shadowy cabal. No transparency, no communication, and a palpable paranoia that clung to every decision they made. With the EPA continuing to dig deeper into the environmental crimes, the HOA doubled down on retaliation against the narrator. New violation notices escalated in frequency and absurdity. A seasonal decoration placed too early. Patio furniture not aligned at a precise angle relative to the house. A garden hose visible from the road. The fines totaled higher each week, accumulating like a debt designed to suffocate. And yet, the narrator did not bend. Every notice, every threat, was documented meticulously. The narrator's folder of evidence thickened, becoming a blueprint for a future lawsuit. But retaliation soon evolved beyond legal intimidation. One night, under the cover of darkness, someone vandalized the narrator's porch. Scratches gouged into the wood, a dead fish thrown across the steps like a grotesque warning. The air smelled of the lake, chemical rot and decay, a stench that symbolized the HOA's contamination of both environment and community spirit. The narrator refused to show fear. Cameras were installed, lights kept on through the night. But inside, unease churned. The narrator understood this was no longer just a dispute about environmental law, it had become personal. The EPA's updates offered limited comfort. Testing revealed illegal concentrations of multiple toxins, not accidental, not incidental, but intentional and sustained. The lake had effectively become a hazardous waste site. Clean-up efforts would require immense resources and time, and the neighborhood could face significant federal oversight. Homeowners worried about the consequences, both financial and legal. Their anxiety needed a target, and for many, the narrator was the most convenient. In their minds, the narrator had invited the government into the community. They clung to the delusion that the HOA could have quietly resolved everything if only no one had spoken up. Fear and irrational blame spread neighbor to neighbor. Those who once waved became strangers with narrowed eyes and hushed gossip. The narrator felt the isolation deepen, the invisible boundary between them and the rest of the neighborhood widening with every passing day. At the lake's edge, the devastation continued to evolve. Frogs disappeared from the reeds. Insects that once skittered across the water vanished. Even the breeze carried the weight of absence. No fluttering wings, no splashes, no sound of life. Nature had fled, leaving behind a dead zone. The narrator found solace in documentation. Taking photos wasn't just evidence gathering. It became a ritual of witnessing, a refusal to let truth be distorted by those who still pretended nothing was wrong. But with every passing week, the narrator wondered whether obsessing over the damage was preserving justice, or only deepening wounds that would never heal. Then came the night that shifted everything, a sudden pounding. Against the door jolted the narrator awake. The sound echoed through the house with frantic urgency. The narrator's heart raced as footsteps approached the entrance cautiously. Peering through the peephole revealed a figure hunched and shivering. A neighbor, one who had never directly shown support, now trembling with fear. Though no words were exchanged, their plea was clear. They pointed toward the lake, eyes wide with terror. The narrator followed them outside, keeping distance but allowing curiosity to lead. The shoreline glowed faintly under moonlight, except for one spot. A section near the center of the lake bubbled violently, releasing a plume of dark vapor that twisted upward like a malignant spirit. The narrator felt a choking sensation as the fumes drifted toward the shore. The neighbors staggered away, covering their mouth, unable to breathe. Something new had awakened in the poisoned water. The next morning, the EPA returned, this time with more equipment, more urgency, and visible alarm. The bubbling had signaled a chemical reaction deep within the lake, decomposition of hazardous waste reaching volatile levels. If it continued, an explosion or widespread release of toxic gas could occur. An emergency perimeter was established around the lake. Sections of the neighborhood were temporarily evacuated. Chaos erupted. Residents fled with belongings hastily stuffed into cars. Officials in protective gear instructed people to remain inside if they stayed. The once idyllic community now resembled a disaster zone, and still some blamed the narrator, accusing them with tear-filled eyes and shaking voices. They refused to accept that the cause of this nightmare started long before one homeowner filed a complaint. But the narrator had no time to appease ignorance. Federal officials arrived at their door. They confirmed that the documentation provided had been crucial in understanding the timeline of contamination. They asked permission to use the narrator's property as the closest safe vantage point for ongoing monitoring. For the first time, the narrator felt like an ally to authority. Not just a whistleblower, but a necessary participant in the investigation. Days blurred into weeks. Medical personnel tested air quality daily. The HOA remained silent, some members disappearing altogether, others communicating only through carefully filtered emails that offered nothing of substance. Lawyers had undoubtedly warned them to keep quiet. New rumors began circulating. Whispers that the HOA president had attempted to negotiate a private settlement to avoid prosecution. That the contractor responsible had destroyed records. That the EPA had uncovered forged permits. Each revelation strengthened the narrator's resolve. This was no longer just an environmental case. It was a criminal one. Yet justice came at a cost. The narrator's peaceful oasis of a home now felt like a fortress under siege. The smell of toxins seeped into dreams. The constant presence of investigators reminded the narrator that disaster loomed just outside every window. There were nights the narrator stared at the dead lake and wondered if saving it was even possible, if the damage was too severe, if the fight had already been lost. But surrender was never an option. Too much had been taken. Too much had been destroyed. The narrator's quiet, suburban life had transformed into a war front, and retreat would never bring peace. Only accountability could. As winter settled in, the lake freezing not with natural beauty, but with a slick layer trapping chemical filth beneath, the narrators steeled themselves for the next chapter. There would be lawsuits. There would be trials. There would be fallout that reshaped the entire community. And when the truth came fully to light, every single person who enabled the poisoning of the lake would face consequences. One homeowner had begun this fight, But the battle was far from over. Winter did not soften the disaster. Rather, it transformed it into a quiet catastrophe that no one could ignore. The lake's surface froze over, not with the pristine clarity of ice skaters' dreams, but with a dull, sickly crust sealing in the toxic sludge beneath. Snow fell occasionally, attempting to blanket the ugliness, but nature could not hide what humans had done. The dead zone remained a constant presence, as undeniable as a scar. The EPA continued working through the cold months, drilling into the ice to test the water below. Some days, steam rose from freshly broken sections as trapped fumes escaped. Other days, federal vehicles idled along the shoreline, lights flashing silently as agents surveyed the damage. The neighborhood's once quiet holiday season became overshadowed by the eerie vigilance of environmental enforcement. And through it all, the Homeowners Association clung desperately to relevance. In the absence of their former leaders, a temporary committee stepped forward. Individuals who had once stayed silent, but now assumed authority with shaky resolve. They sent out newsletters filled with empty promises of working collaboratively with government agencies to restore the lake. They claimed they were victims of deception by past leadership. They implied that everyone needed to move forward as a united community. But unity had dissolved long ago. Rumors proliferated like weeds. Some accused the narrator of overreacting, insisting the lake would have survived if not for outside involvement. Others whispered about plummeting property values, insurance claims denied, and prospective buyers abruptly withdrawing. Fear drove residents to find somewhere to place blame, and the narrator remained the easiest target. Despite that, the narrator pressed forward with legal action. Lawyers reviewed evidence, drafted claims, and prepared what would become a landmark case against both the HOA and the contractor responsible for the dumping. The narrator's determination hardened into something like armor. Every piece of documentation gathered over the months now served a purpose, a weapon in the battle for justice. Yet, with every step toward accountability, the narrator felt the community's resentment sharpen. Cars slowed when passing the house. Neighbors who once exchanged holiday treats now bolted doors when the narrator walked nearby. Children who used to play freely avoided the street altogether. Isolation had evolved into exile. One bitterly cold morning, the narrator noticed a sign planted at the edge of the property, crudely made but unmistakable. It demanded that the narrator leave, accusing them of destroying the neighborhood. The sign was removed and tossed away, but others soon appeared, some nailed to trees, some taped to the mailbox. They were an unspoken chorus of hostility, reminding the narrator that truth did not guarantee respect. At the same time, the EPA disclosed troubling findings. The chemicals in the lake had not merely come from a single incident. They had been dumped repeatedly over time, likely for months before anyone noticed visible signs. This was not negligence. It was systematic disposal. Someone knowingly chose the lake as a cheap landfill. The narrator's anger returned, not the hot, impulsive kind, but a colder, heavier resolve. Each revelation confirmed that whatever backlash they faced from neighbors was insignificant compared to the damage inflicted on the environment. Still, there was one question that tormented the narrator late at night. Who ordered the dumping? The former president, a majority vote, or a single corrupt board member who manipulated everything behind closed doors? The truth hid in documents and testimonies not yet revealed, in motives not yet uncovered. Legal proceedings began with preliminary hearings. The narrator attended, quietly, diligently, sitting among federal employees, attorneys, and experts, ready to unravel the tangled web of liability. The HOA arrived too, but without the confident, polished appearance they once maintained. Their suits were wrinkled, their smiles strained. They looked like people who had finally realized that consequences were real. Reporters soon caught wind of the worsening environmental scandal. Small news vans parked at the community entrance, cameras aimed toward the poisoned lake. Headlines spoke of a suburban neighborhood under federal investigation. The HOA's name became synonymous with negligence and corruption. The same neighbors who had treated the narrator like a pariah now avoided the press entirely, unwilling to be interviewed about a disaster they had once denied. Shame crept through the community like smoke, curling into conversations and suffocating the desperate hope that the problem might simply disappear. Yet the narrator received no apologies, no acknowledgments, no gratitude, just uneasy avoidance and bitter stares. Justice, even when visible, was rarely appreciated by those who had lived comfortably in ignorance. The lawyer working with the narrator explained that the EPA's findings, combined with evidence of falsified paperwork, pointed toward criminal indictments, not just fines or mandated cleanup, but potential prison time for those responsible. The HOA's remaining members reacted by attempting to distance themselves from the former leadership. They pleaded innocence. They claimed they were kept in the dark. They insisted they were as shocked as anyone else. But signatures on approvals told a different story. Their hands were not clean. The narrator watched from their window as a group of residents confronted one of the board members in the middle of the street. Though their words were unheard, their body language told the story clearly. Accusations hurled like daggers, and fear infiltrating every gesture. It struck the narrator then that justice was not a clean process. Even when the truth emerged, the aftermath was messy and painful. People turned on one another. Friendships dissolved. Trust became impossible. And yet, beneath all the turmoil, a small shift began. A few neighbors, cautiously at first, started acknowledging what the narrator had done. They offered brief nods instead of glares. One left a handwritten note expressing quiet thanks for taking action when others were too afraid. Another cleared snow from the narrator's driveway without saying a word. These were not grand gestures, but they hinted at changing perspectives. Fear was giving way to understanding. Denial was unraveling. The lake remained frozen, still dangerous, still mournful. But the narrator noticed something. Footprints in the snow leading to the shoreline. People were visiting again, not to enjoy it, but to confront the consequence of silence and complicity. There was no celebration of progress, no relief, only a shared recognition of how fragile community truly was. Spring would eventually come. The ice would melt. The cleanup would begin. But winter held the neighborhood in a state of reckoning, and no one could escape the reality beneath the cold surface. As snowflakes fell softly over the toxic ice, the narrator looked out at what remained of the lake. Not a success story, not yet, but a promise that wrongdoing would be exposed, that those responsible would answer for their actions. And when that day arrived, this community would have to rebuild, not just the landscape, but themselves. The narrator would be ready. When spring finally emerged, it did not arrive with celebration. The snow melted reluctantly, revealing patches of muddy ground and wilted grass where the toxic water had seeped. The lake thawed in slow agony, dark slush giving way to the same blackened, contaminated depths that had haunted the neighborhood for months. But spring brought movement. Officials, equipment, legal notices, like a tide shifting in favor of accountability. Cleanup crews erected barriers around the lake's perimeter. Excavators tore into the contaminated soil. Workers in protective suits moved carefully, as though any misstep could awaken the poison buried beneath. The HOA could no longer hide. The courts demanded public records. Investigations uncovered secret meetings, falsified environmental reports, and emails revealing that the board had approved the dumping to save thousands in waste disposal costs. It was deliberate. It was criminal. And it was their choice, one driven by greed and the illusion of authority. When arrests were made, the neighborhood changed overnight. The former HOA president, once so proud, so commanding, was escorted from his home in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing lights and gathering crowds. Other board members followed, some crying, others furious at being exposed. The community watched in a stunned hush as the illusion of power collapsed. News vans arrived again, hungry for the next chapter in the scandal. Headlines portrayed the neighborhood as a cautionary tale about corruption in suburban governance. The narrator's name surfaced in articles as the homeowner who brought the truth to light, an unwilling hero thrust into the center of a regional environmental case. Yet in the midst of vindication, the narrator felt no triumph. The lake remained ruined. Wildlife was gone. The peace once cherished felt permanently altered. Victory in the justice system could not erase the grief of what had been lost. The narrator continued to assist officials, documenting progress, monitoring the lake's condition, remaining the most vocal advocate for restoration. The EPA recognized the narrator as a critical witness. Lawsuits moved forward, with the narrator's growing stack of evidence shaping the path toward substantial financial penalties against both the HOA and the contractor who had participated in the dumping. The remaining homeowners, left to grapple with the consequences, held emergency meetings in the clubhouse. Their conversations no longer centered on lawn heights or fence colors. They revolved around environmental recovery, legal settlements, and the need for genuine transparency. The narrator attended some meetings, sitting quietly while neighbors debated costs and responsibility. Some apologized with lowered eyes and stumbling words. Others simply avoided looking in the narrator's direction, too ashamed to acknowledge their past hostility. The narrator understood. People struggled to admit when they were wrong. Fear drove their worst actions, and now that fear had turned into regret. Months passed. The EPA developed a long-term restoration plan for the lake. New vegetation was planted along the banks to stabilize soil. Barriers were installed to filter runoff. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, signs of life returned. Insects buzzed weakly at the surface. A few brave frogs croaked from the reeds. Even a pair of ducks landed one morning, paddling cautiously before lifting away again. It was not much, but it was hope. The narrator spent long evenings on the back porch, observing the transformation. The water remained far from clear, clouds of sediment and pollution still stirring with every breeze. But the silence was gone. Nature was trying. It would take years, perhaps decades, but healing had begun. Meanwhile, the legal consequences rippled outward. Homeowners received compensation for property value loss. The neighborhood's insurance filed claims against the HOA's former leadership. And the narrator, though never seeking personal reward, received damages as well, enough to offset the emotional and financial toll of the ordeal. The HOA itself underwent a complete overhaul. New members were elected, chosen not for their eagerness to enforce trivial rules, but for their commitment to environmental safety and responsible governance. The very structure of community authority had changed, no longer able to operate behind closed doors or twist regulations to suit personal agendas. Some neighbors expressed their gratitude shyly, leaving potted plants or handwritten notes on the narrator's doorstep. Others invited conversation about the future of the lake. Slowly, the wall of resentment that once surrounded the narrator began to crumble. People stopped treating the narrator as the villain of the neighborhood and began to see them as the one who had saved it from its own blindness. Still, there were days the narrator felt the weight of everything that had happened. Nights when the lake's dark surface reflected memories of dead fish and chemical fumes rather than the promise of renewal. Healing wasn't only for the environment. It had to happen within the community, and within the narrator, too. One summer afternoon, as restoration crews paused work, a gentle breeze passed over the water. The narrator noticed tiny ripples near the shore. A small school of fish, new life, darted through the shallow, partially restored habitat. The sight struck the narrator with a quiet, unexpected emotion. For the first time in a long while, the lake didn't look dead. It looked alive. Wounded, yes. Forever changed, absolutely. But alive. That was enough. The narrator realized then that justice was not defined by how loudly it declared victory, but by what it protected. And despite the suffering endured, despite the hostility, isolation, and fear, the narrator had protected something irreplaceable. The lake would never be exactly what it once was, but it would survive, and the neighborhood would learn from the scar it carried. The narrator stood at the water's edge, the sun reflecting faintly across the recovering surface. A deep breath filled their lungs, not of chemical fumes, but of fresh air slowly reclaiming its place. This was the ending the narrator had fought for. Not perfection, not applause, just the truth, restored. And the narrator walked away from the shoreline knowing that whatever the future held, they had done the right thing, alone at first, but ultimately for everyone. The suburban paradise had been broken and rebuilt, and the lake, once taken for granted, finally had champions who understood its worth.